Welcome to the NewsHour. A highly anticipated report from the State Department concludes that the U.S. may continue to send weapons to Israel despite apparent Israeli violations of international humanitarian law. The findings come just 2 days after the president said he would suspend shipment of 3,500 bombs to Israel as it now surges forces around Rafah in southern Gaza. The administration has said it opposes a full-scale ground invasion of Rafah City, where more than 1 million Gazans are sheltering. Here to walk through the details of this report at the end of this eventful week is our Nick Schifrin. So, Nick, tell us more about this report. What more did it say?
The National Security Memorandum number 20 that this report is based on requires the Department of State to obtain, quote, credible and reliable written assurances that Israel, as well as half a dozen other countries that gets U.S. weapons, are using those weapons in accordance of international humanitarian law and not restricting U.S. humanitarian assistance. And the report is very critical, as you said, about the former aspect of that. Quote, it is reasonable to assess that defense articles covered under National Security Memorandum 20 have been used by Israeli security forces since October the 7th in instances inconsistent with its international humanitarian law obligations. It also says, while Israel has the knowledge, experience, and tools to implement best practices for mitigating civilian harm in its military operation, the results on the ground, including high levels of civilian casualties, raise substantial questions as to whether the IDF is using them effectively in all cases. The report is less critical on humanitarian aid, by the way. We do not currently assess that the Israeli government is prohibiting or otherwise restricting the transport or delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance. But after all that, the report's bottom line is, as you said at the top, the U.S. could have cut off weapons to Israel based on this report, but it did not. The assessment there, quote, U.S. government currently assesses the assurances provided by each recipient country, again, Israel and half a dozen others, to be credible and reliable. That is the threshold for this report, so as to allow the provision of defense articles covered under NSM 20 to continue. In other words, the weapons will keep going.
As we mentioned, a highly anticipated report. So what kind of reaction are these findings now getting?
The report makes its final conclusion that Israel's weapons can continue to go, in part because of the nature of fighting Hamas and also what Israel has done internally. So Hamas, a terrorist organization, the U.S. describes it hiding in tunnels, hiding among the civilian population, and it describes how difficult of an environment of war that is for the Israeli Defense Forces, and it says there are IDF lawyers embedded in what it does and has taken steps to hold itself accountable, including criminal actions against certain officials. And that's the context that leads former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Dana Stroll to argue the report struck the right balance.
What this report is saying is that there are instances in which Israel has not achieved or lived up to its obligations, but it's also a professional military who has investigative processes and accountability mechanisms. And when many of the mistakes have been made over the course of the past 7 months, the Israel Defense Forces and the government of Israel have taken corrective measures to address the mistakes and move forward in a way that mitigates civilian harm.
But others are much more critical of Israel and of the report. They cite specific instances, including one that the report itself cites. There you see on the Jabalia refugee camp in October, the report says that killed dozens of children and wounded hundreds as an example of a violation of international humanitarian law. The argument there is that Israel should face consequences, says Charles Blaha, who's a former career Foreign Service officer who worked in the State Department's office that monitors if countries comply with international humanitarian law.
The government's report had said that. The government's report says things like it raises concerns, and there are acts that are inconsistent with international humanitarian law. That is a dodge. The conclusions that flow from what even the report says, but certainly from what the task force's report said, is that Israel has violated international humanitarian law in its use of U.S. origin items, and that should have been the clear assessment of the department's report.
And so the debate will go on both about what Israel is doing and the report's conclusions. But again, the U.S. said tonight the weapons will continue.
Nick Schifrin with the latest on this late-breaking news today. Nick, thank you.
Thank you.